Thank you. This is the first of our series of 4 talks held every Tuesday in October. And please join us for the next 3. The one on October 15th is going to be actually hosted by some of our graduate students. Our graduate students actually took some of our data from our long-term monitoring data on the Patuxent and actually have a peer-reviewed publication that came out this year, and they'll be sharing that with you next week. And then for some of you might have come down and looked and seen activities out in front, and they've got the nets. Well, there's been a long-term sailing activity and looking at the fish population over decades, and Ryan Woodland will be speaking to that on October 22nd. And then on October 29th, there is a long-term monitoring program that one of our professors, Dr. Chris Rao, has been running, joined with the Patuxent Naval Air Base. And so Jessica McGlindsey, who's a PhD student in his lab, will be talking all about terrapins and issues with climate change and the long-term implications on that site for those terrapins. So again, welcome. We are the Chesapeake Biological Laboratory. We were founded in 1925 by Reginald Truitt. One of our buildings right opposite is named after him. And our 100-year, so for those who do math, our 100-year celebration is coming up. So this is really, really exciting. We're going to have lots of activities to plan, so watch this space. Our next open house will be September 6th next year. It was September 7th this year, so welcome to join us for that. So we are the oldest state-supported marine lab on the East Coast. We are one of 6 constituent members of the University of Maryland Center for Environmental Science. We have laboratories all the way in the mountains, the Appalachian Lab in Frostburg, our Cove Point Laboratory in Cambridge on the Eastern Shore, also IMET, downtown Baltimore, the Institute of Marine and Environmental Technology. Also, we partner with Sea Grant at College Park and the integration and application. This is my 3rd talk today. So we talked about integration and application network, also over in Cambridge. So what do? We have a near 100-year tradition of researching and providing innovative solutions to regional and global environmental problems. And we tend to focus quite a lot on our fisheries science, our biogeochemistry and toxicology, and also, as you'll hear today, ecosystem studies and restoration science. So our scientists go out there, they gather, they interpret data to better understand our world and to inform policy. So there's something that's very unique about our institution is that we have a state mandate. It's our mission to provide advice to the state agencies in terms of things like sustainable fisheries or ecosystem restoration and management. So we're making a difference, though, not just here in Maryland, but in the nation, around the world. A lot of people look to the Chesapeake Bay as a model for their systems globally. So we do quite a bit of work on water quality monitoring, advice to the state and region, and quite a bit recently in terms of impacts and causes and implications of climate change. So to that point, we have a long-term monitoring program that's off our pier. Some of you drove past, walked past. You saw that climate stripes display. That is our actual water temperature data from off the pier. And you can clearly see the trend to warming temperatures. Another thing that this monitoring program looks at is water height. And this was actually last week, every day in the last couple of weeks, it floods here on Charles Street, right in front of the Tiki Bar. That's actually our only official way off the island. And so if you go to our Patuxent Centennial website, you can look at all of this data in real time. There's the QR code. The QR code is also on the water bottles if you want to take a water carton. But you can see this above that red line. That's when it starts flooding by the Tiki Bar. And you can see the last couple weeks, every time there's a high tide, it was above that. And so that's what it looks like outside the Tiki Bar. So we have some new initiatives happening, building on that, as well as looking at traditional water quality monitoring parameters. We are looking at things like emerging contaminants. I'm sure you've all heard of things like PFAS, personal care products, UV filters, pharmaceuticals. All of these things are on our waterway, but you need very sophisticated and analytical equipment to look at them And we were fortunate to get a $1 million donation from Brian Hockheimer and Marjorie Wax, and that's now got 2 high-end pieces of equipment that are going to allow us to look at contaminants at picogram per liter concentrations, really, really low concentrations, so we can see what's out there. The other key thing is, how do you fix it? What can you do? And so our chemist, Michael Gonz here, Andrew Hayes here, have some fantastic techniques that are allowing them to trace septic sources. So if you see some contaminants in the river, you're like, well, where did that come from? If you know where it comes from, you can try to provide a solution to that problem. I just mentioned our community engagement in terms of signage. That's that Solomon's climate site, that sign that I just showed you. That's our water temperature data. And you can clearly see the blue is cold, the red is warmer, and that's over time. And you can see over the last few, few years, the trend to those warmer temperatures. And then we also have displays on submerged aquatic vegetation as well. So the other thing, there's a display out there, our Dolphin Watch. I know I mentioned this in the spring series, but if you're not aware of our Dolphin Watch program, this is a fantastic community engagement program. It is in its 8th year. It's a phone app. Android or iPhone, the QR code is there. You download this anytime you're out on the water and you see a dolphin. How many people have seen dolphins? Oh, how many people have the app? Okay, we need a few more hands. So there's leaflets at the back outside in the foyer. Please use the app. What this does is anytime you see a dolphin, take a picture, send it to us. Our scientists verify that it was actually a dolphin and not some skate or something in the water. And what that's doing is allowing us to see where the dolphins are. And what this has shown us that dolphins are going further and further north. They're coming in earlier into the bay. So, this is really how you can help us as scientists know where the dolphins are. So really, really would encourage your participation, and thank you for helping us with that. Okay. So as you drove in, you might have seen we have a new building going up on campus. This is a $22 million investment by the state of Maryland. This is our Chesapeake Analytics Collaborative building. So of course, as you know, we are right here. You're here. This is our pier. The building is going right next to Bevan Hall, our first building that was built in 1916, I think. But anyway, this is what it looks like. It actually now has a roof part as of today. But this is what it's going to look like. And it's going to be right there on the front. So that's going to house a lot of new meeting spaces. One of the new initiatives here at UMCES is our Chesapeake Global Collaboratory. And what that's doing is bringing everybody together. Science isn't about scientists anymore. Science is a bit about bringing community members, all of the groups, all different stakeholders together to try to address these complex social environmental problems that we have right now. So finally, to finish up with the other thing, as well as the research and the advice to the state, we do obviously graduate education. And we have some wonderful students there in the back. Put your hands up. See? Oh, they're too shy. So thank you for coming out. Some of them will be talking next week. So we have a very innovative graduate curriculum, very interdisciplinary foundation. Our graduate students solve real world problems, and they go on to very successful careers in the private sector, in the government, in NGOs, and also in academia. And so just a plug, I can't do my job correctly if I don't plug, please try and support our graduate students if you can. The QR code there, there's some outside, but any donations help support their research and their professional development activities. So thank you. So with that, that was very fast and furious. I didn't talk that fast earlier. So I would like to introduce Professor Lora Harris, who has, she's an estuarine ecologist, and she does quite a lot of different work in terms of field and modeling approaches to look at things in terms of nutrient dynamics, primary productivity, ecosystem structure and function, and also effective restoration strategies. She also is very committed to education and also increasing the diversity and inclusion of those in the geosciences, and leads a number of large research programs in that area. So with that, I would like to welcome Lora Harris, and thank you.
All right, so we have a small technical intervention, and I want to make sure that, oh, we're at the thank you already, that Tom has everything he needs in the other room as well. And I'm gonna stop the share because we have to reshare. What? Did I do this right?
Yep.
I did it right, and
But you still need to share on.
share
There you go.
screen one. All right,
Thank you.
is there a thumbs up from CBL in the other room, Jerry Frank? And I don't know if the camera will actually see me if I'm too tall.
No, it's not that you're too tall, Laura, it's that if I get you any of the screen behind you on, it washes you.
And then I look bad, I don't want that.
No, it's like there's no light.
All right. Okay, well, good enough. Are we all set? All right, thank you, Tom. Thanks everyone for coming here on a Tuesday night at 7:15. I really value your time, and I'm glad we get a chance to talk tonight. And thanks to my colleagues and the students for showing up to support as well. I know they'll ask the hard questions, so if not today, tomorrow. So I've been here at the Chesapeake Biological Laboratory since the fall of 2007. And as Karis mentioned, I do a number of different things. And I know as you all were walking in, I got a chance to talk with you about some of my other programs. Along with Jeremy Testa, I run another monitoring program that's focused on water quality in Calvert County's tidal creeks and Solomon's Harbor. Walter Boynton, who's here tonight, started that program in Solomon's Harbor in the 1980s, and Jeremy and I have continued that, and it's expanded. So if you see me on the Board of County Commissioners website giving my annual presentation with Cindy Ross wearing the same suit, yes, I will be in the same suit. That's another thing that I do here in the county, and you're always welcome to come to those presentations. We try to do those to report out on our work for all of you. So I do a lot of that local work, and then I do, as Karis mentioned, I have some programs that are focused on social justice issues in the geosciences. Some of them are educationally based around the island communities of our U.S. territories in Guam, Puerto Rico, and the U.S. Virgin Islands. And some of them are around community engagement and equitable exchange with communities of color in particular. So if any of those are interesting, I'd love to talk more about my work and to also hear what you're all interested in. And thinking about science for communities, I do want to center on you all. And so I wanted to talk about Cove Point because I've never really given a talk like this at Solomon's for our neighbors. And I know some of you live in the Cove Point community. And so in that context, I also think as I go through this is a 3-act talk. We're going to try to make sure we're all on the same page with some basic knowledge about wetlands. We're going to talk about sea level rise, and then we're going to talk about wetlands. And we're going to talk about Cove Point. And what I'll say is that when we engage in questions of restoration and climate change impact that are local, they can be pretty emotional topics. And I just want to recognize that for any of you who live in this community, who live here local to the lab, you know, those climate stripes, they're something that we talk about a lot, and it's really because we feel that same sense of care and concern about what's happening in our environment that's affecting all of you. So that's where I'm coming from with this. And if I'm talking very technical about your backyard and you're like, oh, you know, talk to me later, because I don't want to get anyone upset just because I'm focused on presenting the science and the monitoring context. Sound okay? And I'm gonna do the first two acts, and then everyone needs a brief intermission after the first two acts. So we're gonna check in to make sure we're all on the same page and then dive into Cove Point. I'm gonna have the same challenge Karis did. All right, so these are all the folks and more who have worked on this project with me. Some of them are here in this room, Cindy Ross and Julia Smeltzer, if you can raise your hands. I really want to give a lot of credit to Erin Riley and Shelby Johnson, who contributed some of the materials for this talk through our past presentations. And Walter may even recognize a couple slides in here from that wetland lecture we used to teach. So it's a community effort, and we couldn't do it without all these wonderful people. And I'm going to highlight some of them in photos for inside jokes. So this is Melissa Day, who started out working on this project with me. And we're going to start our first act really thinking about wetlands and what they are. And this is a picture of Melissa at the Cove Point Marsh in the midst of some frag, getting ready to go out on one of our kayaks. And it's important to pay a little bit of attention to this image. She's in water, there are plants growing, she's wearing waders. So there's a lot of little forensic cues here about the kind of environment we work in when we're working in these wetlands. Wetlands can be all kinds of different ecosystem types. And so it's important to remember that even mangroves are a type of wetland. When you go down to Florida or in subtropical environments and you see mangrove communities, that's a kind of wetland. Peatlands that are further north, that are boggy and moist, but without tall vegetation, those are also wetlands. And wetlands exist on every continent except the Antarctic. And this is a map of the United States because I wanted to give you a sense of that with this green color indicating where most of our wetlands are. And you can see that there are just a ton of these in the mid-Atlantic and around Florida. So this is a very important habitat. And then it extends into the Gulf communities as well, especially right here around New Orleans, just tons of wetland communities. We have a few official definitions for wetlands. Wetlands end up being a point of regulation for our federal policies. And so what that means is that we have two different important definitions, and they are related, but I want to make sure they're written out so you all know that there are federal contexts for thinking about wetlands. An ecological definition might be that a wetland is an ecosystem where the substrate is always wet. And it's wet enough of the time that only specialized plants can survive in that environment. So any of you, like me, who have house plants you overwater, understand that you have to be a special kind of bird to live in really wet, mucky soil. And that's a big part of how we define wetlands. And then the Clean Water Act has a lot more words around it. I don't know if it's necessarily more specific, but it does end up providing some boundaries for how we define and delineate wetlands. You actually have specialists in the ecological field who just do wetland delineation. And they talk about in this definition more specifically about what we mean by super wet soil. So it has to be inundated or saturated by surface or groundwater at a frequency and duration sufficient to support, and that under normal circumstances do support, that sounds like legalese, a prevalence of vegetation typically adapted for life in saturated soil conditions. And here's just a few examples of what those are. So Cove Point, we call a marsh. That's what most people around here call the Cove Point community, but there's bogs, and I'll show a couple of photos of other examples as well. This is, I think, an important thing to know is where does the wetland end? We kind of know where it begins. It begins where the soil gets really, really wet so that only these special plants can grow there. And then it ends where that emergent vegetation can no longer grow, which is typically around 2 meters in most estuaries and marsh and coastal mid-Atlantic. So I just want to, I'm gonna throw a few slides at you just as we get in the same mindset about what is a wetland. So this hydric soil thing, like why is Laura obsessed about that? Wet soils, saturated soils. This is actually a very important feature that ends up structuring the entire community. And that's because plants underneath in their root system, if they don't have specialized structures, they need oxygen. And hydric, constantly saturated soils have a region of the soil profile that is always without oxygen. So wetland plants have specialized cells. Some of them have parenchyma, which are like almost having a straw inside of the stem of the plant that creates a little snorkel for the plant to the surface. That's what a lot of our plants have here, is this specialized cells called parenchyma. Mangroves, if you've ever been in a mangrove forest, you see they have little kind of spiky things sticking up, and those are also their way of getting oxygenated material into the sediment. So this is very, very important for who ends up being able to survive at the surface. And so I just want to flash a few pretty pictures at you. We have a lot of these Typha marshes here in Calvert County in the freshwater portion of our tidal creeks. So when we go do our Calvert County creek monitoring, when we get far up in those little creeks, we'll see some cattails, some narrow-leaved cattails. In Calvert County, we also have these cypress swamp estuaries. This is the most northern reach of the cypress swamp wetland. So this is also a kind of a wetland. Here's some mangroves, and then we have marshes in Georgia that would be just like what you would have right in the ocean if you went to North Carolina on vacation, or South Carolina, or to Virginia. And all these are very different. The work that I'm going to be focused on today really thinks most about mesohaline wetlands that are tidal. So they have a tidal influence from the Chesapeake Bay. But the Cove Point Marsh that is behind the beach is largely composed of freshwater species and is not really tidal. So Cove Point's weird because we get to manage both kinds of environments. And they're all wetlands. It's just that they're dealing with different stresses, and the plants that have evolved to live there take different kind of flavors. They've adapted to what that setting is like. All right, that was Act 1. Everybody feeling okay? Yeah. All right, Act 2, sea level rise and wetlands. So let's just talk about what exactly sea level rise is. Sea level rise is a natural process. It happens regardless of what humans are doing, but we can have an impact on the rate of sea level rise in this current geologic era. And that's because there are two processes that influence how fast sea level rise happens. And this is kind of global, pretty simple ideas around sea level rise. There's many other aspects to this that a talk by someone like Hallie Kilborn, who's here at the lab and wrote the most recent projections for the state of Maryland, could give you more on, but I just want to give you the basics of what are the factors that influence sea level rise. So the first is that thermal expansion of ocean water, which is due to climate change, causes that water to expand and rise. And that's a pretty mind-boggling thing to think about, because you've had cold water and you've had hot water in a cup, and you probably haven't noticed dramatic increases in volume. But at a global scale, that can translate to quite a bit of change over time. The second process, this says one, should say two, that's very globally relevant to sea level rise rates are melting of glaciers and polar ice sheets. And this is one of the things that's fairly difficult to model and predict. And because of that, the thermal expansion we can predict really well. It's kind of basic physics, Boyle's law. How fast glaciers disappear is much harder to simulate with our numerical models. And so this is where a lot of our uncertainty is around sea level rise. And then there are lots and lots of local factors that influence how fast a particular rate is at a particular location. Here in the Mid-Atlantic, we're strongly influenced by what happens with the Gulf Stream and the Atlantic, and also in terms of subsidence. So here in Maryland, the ground is sinking as sea level is increasing. There are a lot of impacts of sea level rise. So when we talk about sea level rise, in my mind, I am simultaneously thinking about all of these different factors that can end up affecting communities like ours. So there can be accelerated erosion, there can be storm surges that are stronger. This is, one of the factors we're seeing in a lot of the resilience and disaster response from hurricanes. Stormwater management systems are typically only designed to a certain threshold. My colleagues Slava Lyubchik and Hallie Kilborn recently provided, and if I get this wrong, Slava, correct me, new projections for precipitation in Calvert County in order to help them to reset what those thresholds should be. Did I get it right?
Yes.
We can have rising groundwater because the sediment between the Chesapeake Bay and our coastal plain watersheds is porous. Water goes back and forth through those sand beaches. And that can cause impacts to groundwater, but also saltwater intrusion. And where I live in southern Anne Arundel County, the saltwater intrusion issue is going to affect tens of thousands of homeowners in the next 10 to 15 years. And so in Maryland, as I mentioned, some of my colleagues have started a wonderful habit of writing sea level rise projections for the state. Don Bosch leads this, but my colleague Hallie Kilborn is a key author, as are Bill Boycord and Ming Lee and several others. And so this is kind of where we are as of 2023. The most recent report came out in 2023 and they update it every 5 years. And we are expected to see sea level rates of 1 to 1.5 feet by 2050 compared with 2005. So we have to remember there's already been some sea level rise, so we're always using a benchmark number. And if you look at these projections, this is for Baltimore. They kind of use Baltimore as the standard for the state. We may exceed 4 feet, but there's a lot of uncertainty because of things like that. How fast is a glacier melt problem? What I wanted to show you, because model predictions are not what are happening, is that we also have data measuring this of what's already happened. And so here are some monthly mean sea level values for different areas of Maryland, and Solomon's is here. And when you look at these data with the time on this axis and the rate, it's not even the rate, it's the actual sea level on the y-axis, then the line represents how fast that sea level is changing over time, right? So go back to your early algebra class and it's y over x is the slope, right? So the slope is this magical thing that gives us an actual rate that we can predict for sea level rise based on historical data. And monitoring data are wonderful for this. So I'm so glad that that's being highlighted in this series. We really count on monitoring data to help us do our work. What you probably notice is that the line for Solomon's, at least I do, maybe you have to get obsessive about this, the line for Solomon's is steeper than the other ones. So what does that mean? Not a student answering. It means here it's actually about 20% faster than the other locations of measurement. And we need to be thoughtful about that. And so when I talk about, the emotion and the grief that we can sometimes feel by looking at these data, that's a very local experience, right? This is an actual photo. This is not AI. It was taken by the Baltimore Sun, so it looks nice, but this is Baltimore, Inner Harbor. And this is just some of the things that I've already said. Maryland's more vulnerable than other locations globally. There's lots of little hot spots for sea level rise all over the world, and we're in that unhappy club. And a lot of that has to do with the issue of subsidence, that sinking land problem. And I'm sure that all of you have experienced this. Kara showed a picture of what we call nuisance flooding. And that's one word for it, right? But what we're actually experiencing is sea level rise. That's an impact of sea level rise. Okay. In this picture, I mean, oh, now that I live closer to Annapolis, it's even more in my face. Annapolis is the city in the United States. This blew my mind when I heard this statistic. The capital, it's the capital in the whole United States that has the most daylight flooding of any of the capitals. So this is down at the end of Main Street. So I'm showing a local picture, but I'm reminding us this happens everywhere. And so there's a lot of people working on how do we grapple with this mashup of people liking to live along the coast. Most humans live along coasts, and the fact that climate change is affecting and impacting the experience we have of living along that coast. There has been a recent move towards thinking about nature and nature-based features in restoration. And by this, we mean using living shorelines, using plants, using oysters, restoring natural features in order to create more resilience along the coastline to flooding, to storm surge, et cetera, et cetera. And we have a colleague, his name is Dr. Ming Lee at the Horn Point Laboratory. He had a special network of scientists in the Coastlines and People program at NSF. And a group of us came together and wrote a paper on some of these nature and nature-based features in restoration. And I'm just gonna highlight a couple of them. And one of the things I want you to notice is that these have not been implemented yet. So we wrote a paper about how they planned it, how they'd come together with community to help design it, or they hadn't, the science they'd used to figure it out. But they actually have started, I think this one is mostly done, the living breakwaters, and Galveston is just starting. So that's something to keep in the back of your mind. And so this is in Raritan Bay in New York. This project really grew out of the impacts of Hurricane Sandy and the realization in New York City that they had to do something to create more resilience of the city to those kinds of storm surges. And they have decided to use that by creating these breakwaters. So those of you who live at Cove Point, this may seem like, whoa. They're also stacking these breakwaters, and the thing that makes this nature-based with oyster cages. And they've specially designed the oyster cages to be particularly good at kind of lowering storm surge when it comes through. Oops. The other project that we highlighted was in Galveston Bay. And this one you can see is very much like, looks pretty and looks real, but is all landscape engineer renderings. And this one, they also used a pretty big combination of solutions, some of them nature-based, like restored beach and dune systems, but also an engineered gate system to really protect Galveston from the Gulf of Mexico. So these are being considered, implemented, used in many other parts of the United States. And there's a lot of like experimentation going on about how we should do this. So that's setting the stage. We've had Act 1 and Act 2. Act 3, we're gonna dive into Cove Point, but I want to give people, I'm gonna take a drink of water. That's really my reason for doing this. But I also want to invite anyone now. We're not gonna go off on long tangents, but if there's a question for clarity that you have, I'm hoping that you'll feel like, okay, I kind of know what wetlands are, or I do know. And sea level rise, now I have like an idea of what Laura's talking about with that, even if not all the nuance. So are there any questions for clarity at this point?
Why is Solomon's sea level rise higher than the other areas?
Oh, that's such a good question. You know, Solomon's, I don't know the answer, so I want to say that first. I will say if we think of where the other gauges were, Annapolis and Baltimore, that's in a different part of the bay, right? And they're actually much further north from us, so that's one thing that gets my head going. I'd also say that Solomon's is at the mouth of this confluence with Patuxent and the bay. And so the answer to that likely lies in physics, and my hydrodynamic modeling colleagues like Bill Boycourt or Ming Lee would be able to explain more how the estuarine circulation of the bay, the bay kind of operates in this belt of salt, you know, with salty water from the ocean going up the bay and fresh water coming back down in this nice conveyor belt. And that also interacts with winds and tides, and it creates density-driven changes in where the water goes. So in Jug Bay, the first year I was here, I was trying to do work in Jug Bay and Lothian, and it was one of these years where the tides just seemed crazy, right? Everyone was like, what is going on? And it actually ended up that year in particular was about wind patterns. And there was a shift in wind direction that year that caused all of this pileup essentially of the water on that density driven gradient. So those are the things that come to mind, but my physical oceanographer colleagues would know the real answer.
Like speculation.
That was my speculating. We're not as far north as Baltimore and Annapolis, and
So I'll
so,
give you a speculation.
all right, go for it.
You go back to the last major glacial period, weight of the ice depressed the Earth's surface. And in front of that ice, it created a bulge. It's like when you put your hand in mud, it causes the mud to come up in front of it. The forebulge for the last glaciation happens to be right where Solomon's is
Okay.
located today.
So the subsidence here is
So
more
we
dramatic.
have subsidence, it goes down faster than before the forebulge or after.
Right. Yeah, well, and now like Philippe Pencil, now I'm going on a nerdy tangent, excuse me, but Philippe Pencil at NOAA's National Geodetic Survey is also looking at that in combination with our groundwater withdrawals across the entire region, and having to include that in thinking about those subsidence rate in addition to the long-term geological effects.
Talked about the land subsidence and the sea level rise. How are they measured? Absolutely. I mean, where is the reference point?
Yeah, you need to be on our surface elevation table working group. So we actually have a surface elevation table working group. And what that is, and I'll show you some photos in a minute, is crazy people like my team, like Cindy and Julia. They like to go out and figure out how to measure millimeters of change in the wetland. And we do that by putting deep broad benchmarks in the marsh, which I'll show you a picture of two awesome scientists doing it from my group in a little bit. So we pounded about 60 feet of stainless steel rod into all these wetlands to a point of no resistance. We cement them in place, and then we have these special instruments for measuring elevation all around those. So if you ever come upon a weird looking wood boundary with a benchmark in the middle, that might be one of my sites, and don't touch it, because we're trying to measure this much change every year. I think Cindy's gonna be going out with Caitlin and Julia in about 3 weeks. Now the challenge is the subsidence issue, and we didn't used to be able to do that well, but now we have RTK GPS, which is incredibly precise to the millimeter change. And we deploy the lab's RTK GPS in 48-hour cycles every 3 to 4 years. And we triangulate that with this network that I'm a part of to help estimate the subsidence rates. So we're using like absolute elevation and relative elevation together to get at that. Yeah.
Okay, I echo what you found in Solomon's. I live and work on St. Leonard Creek. And I've got almost a half century of data, and it's happening there too. And I'm sort of with Ralph. I think foreload has a significant substance of foreload has a significant effect. It's scary. I built a dock 2002, and we used all the data I had from the late 1980s to determine where the highest tides were. Built the dock a foot above that. It was this far from flooding this week with the king tides probably.
Yeah.
And that's coming.
Yeah, so that's where this is, it becomes emotional because it's your actual backyard and definitely something we have to be thoughtful about when we talk about the work. All right, we ready to dive into Cove Point? So I was really happy to be a part of that study, but one of the things that was interesting to me was that there hadn't been that many examples of this kind of restoration, even though I've been working on one since 2010 here in our backyard. So Galveston wasn't done a few years ago, Raritan Bay is just being done, but we actually have an example here in Calvert County where people have been experimenting with how do we do this kind of mitigation. And so I'm going to tell the story of Cove Point and probably surely get things wrong in that history. But this is kind of how we tell this story. And so here I'm sharing some maps. I love maps, whether they're aerial images or pre-aerial image maps. And, you know, this is all of Cove Point. And I figured this was a local audience. So if you need orientation, the lab is over here, here from this map. And Cove Point is this feature on the western shore of the Chesapeake Bay. So let's just point out a few things here. It's a clear little like weirdly triangular shape sticking off of the county. In 1905, they hatched it for wetland all along this portion of the coastline. When we look here in 1939, we can see the roads laid out for the Cove Point community, but probably building was just beginning. And I also want you to note that, yeah, there's marsh extending down just like in this image, and there's very little water. So that's another thing to pay attention to. And here's the same area in 1969. You can see some of the houses built out. You can see similar amounts of water in the back marsh, in the Cove Point Marsh. And so I'm going to do a terrible job of trying to explain cuspate foreland progression because I am not a geomorphologist, but it's so important to Cove Point that I feel like I'm going to give it my best shot. And there might be some folks in the audience here who know more than me on this who can speak up. And I would welcome that. So basically, the Cove Point triangle is what geomorphologists call a cuspate foreland. And what this means is that we have accretion and movement of sediment off of, and this is from a field trip from Kurt Larson and Inga Clark that was done in 2003. So I'm definitely borrowing from them because you can hear me like, oh, this is the most awkward part of Lora's talk. It's a movement of sediment that's coming off of those Calvert cliff formations and using the longshore currents along the western portion of the Chesapeake Bay, pushing that sediment down, and then intersecting with both shifts in where the wind fetch happens across the Chesapeake Bay and where southerly wave action kind of pushes up against the southerly end of the cuspate spit. So really what we have to think about here is that sediment's moving down. There's a huge fetch across the Chesapeake Bay at this point in the Calvert Cliffs formation. There's a lot of winter northerly winds that are also pushing things up against the county shoreline. And then it's intersecting with wave action, the predominant wave action from the south that's kind of sandwiching that sand into this cuspate formation. How did I do? Okay. I think that was a B minus. And the thing to note with this, these are results from a master's thesis actually dating that progression, is that this formation wants to move. It wants to move. Many of our shoreline features want to move. And these data that are cores that help to date that progression show that movement all along the Calvert shoreline. So the results are that this beach is on the leading edge of the Calvert cliffs formation and is steadily migrating at about 1.5 meters per year. You can see dated progressions from 1848 to 1993. Okay, so I'm providing you with this context because it's important to remember that sandy things like to move. That's how I would say this in plain language. Sandy things like to move. They're affected by wind, tides, and waves. And this particular feature, combined with the Calvert cliffs, has moved and will move. So we've got that going on. We have the fact that it's a wetland, has colonized and populated the whole thing. And then we have all this climate change happening on top of that, right? So this is what it looks like now. I'm looking at the clock and getting a little terrified, but we're gonna do this. This is an image from, not now, from 2007. So this is from just before I moved to Calvert County. And hopefully what you'll notice is that a lot of the marsh is already gone by 2007. We're not 100% sure. I'm gonna have this start while I'm talking. Move it here. But one of the things that I had heard was that there was a big amount of Phragmites, which is an invasive reed that started to grow along the shoreline of Cove Point. And there were really well-intentioned people who wanted to get rid of that. And Phragmites is an invasive plant. It's also really good at holding on to sediment. And so there was a challenge with, not that long after a lot of the Phragmites was removed, there was a big nor'easter that came through and blew through the shoreline into the back freshwater marsh, creating complete open access to what had been a pretty precious ecosystem for both locals and the state, because there are a lot of rare, threatened, and endangered plants that used to grow and still grow in Cove Point Marsh. So Dominion, who has their offshore facility for, I don't know if they're receiving or giving gas anymore. So they had a problem to solve because they needed to dredge this, right? And at the same time, in the state of Maryland, we were doing a huge experiment on Poplar Island of taking dredge spoil from Baltimore Harbor and helping to fight against sea level rise on Poplar Island in this big experiment of dredge spoil deposition. And Dominion said, well, we're only moving it back where it probably just came from. And they got permits to do this restoration. And Bob Gardner, who was the real mind behind a lot of this design and the engineering solutions, he once told me he's a belt and suspender kind of guy. And this design has both nature-based features. So they restored a wetland behind the revetment. They built out a wetland, and they put in a rock hardened shoreline revetment plus breakwaters. And so what I want you to notice, this is a Dominion produced video, but it's kind of giving you a sense of the restoration. You know, what I really want you to focus on is that there's a big combination of things. Many of these features are in all those case studies that we just published a paper on as being like, this is what we need to be experimenting with to be practical around how to deal with climate change on our coasts, okay? So we already have some information to think about how this might work. And here's kind of a cartoon drawing of that. The revetment was put into place here. There are these segmented breakwaters, and then they built out the wetland and planted it with Spartina, which is a mesohaline, a saltier plant species. And then they contacted the lab and said, we need someone to monitor and see whether this is working or not. And I will say that is incredibly rare. That was a requirement of the Maryland DNR permit. So that was part of their permit requirements, was that they had to do 20 years of monitoring post restoration. So my group's been working on that restoration now for almost 50, I think we're in our 14th year. I always get it off by a year, but I think it's been 14 years. And these are some of the things that we do. We monitor the water behind the dune system for salinity changes. There used to be continuous water quality monitoring up through the first 10 years of the project. We do a lot of plant diversity and vegetation monitoring, and we measure with those, they're called surface elevation tables now. We got rid of the sediment, but these surface elevation tables to try to measure rates of sea level rise. So in the little bit I have left, I'm going to just show you what some of those measurements look like and hopefully some of the big takeaways. And to give you an idea of what we do, we collect salinity measurements in the freshwater marsh monthly. We do a shoreline inspection to make sure that there's no problem with the valve system that's underneath the revetment or with breaches that might have occurred. And we measure conductivity continuously in the marsh. On an annual basis, we measure percent cover of the vegetation. So how much of one of these squares are the plants covering? We document invasive vegetation biomass, largely Phragmites, but there's also a big Lesbideza invasion in Cove Point Marsh. And then we work with Brent Sturry, who does a rare, threatened, and endangered survey of the plants there. And then we have our surface elevation tables. On a less annual basis, for 10 years, we did all this stuff every year, but recently in the second decade of the monitoring, it becomes every 2 years or every 5 years. We take drone shoreline imagery and marsh imagery, and we do that with William Narden at the Horn Point Lab. We're measuring shoreline profiles, and you'll see some of those data. We use a peat plot method for biodiversity in the freshwater marsh, and we document water levels in the marsh behind the dune. So just a few fun take-homes from this. One of the things that we wanted to figure out was how fast does it take after the restoration to get plant vegetation cover up to a good, healthy level. And we thought it might take years. And what I want you to notice in this is year on the x-axis, and this is percent cover, which 100% is like, it's only plants, which is kind of what this image is. And you can see that within just a few years, we kind of had really gotten to an equilibrium in most of our transects, except for the 6th transect that is below the revetment. So it took a just really rapid colonization of the marsh, mostly stayed the same, except for this area below the revetment. We also documented the biodiversity, especially in the freshwater marsh. There's so many different plants, and Julia's going to be our expert on this in the next year or so. And this is something that's important, but diversity isn't the only way to talk about quality of the vegetation. So we also do a floristic quality index that's looking at both diversity, but whether that plant is one of our rare, threatened, and endangered species, or whether it's an invasive species. And so this is kind of an index of that. And it's a little bit all over the place, but these FQI scores are actually quite good. And what they told us was that there was a seed bank in the mud that allowed a lot of the freshwater plants to come back very rapidly after the restoration happened. And that's a very hopeful story to me. Those seeds were there. They were just waiting for the freshwater to come back. And that's definitely clear with Brent's data. This is just a map of some of the ammonia. I'm not allowed to show you the most recent data because some people go and harvest this. So this is an older map. But this is an RTE species, and it's all over the place out there, which is really remarkable. And it wasn't even put in the permit because they're like, that's not going to happen. Elevation change. This is not unusual for a restoration site where we are seeing great accretion. So this is days since installation of one of our surface elevation tables. Here's Mindy and Casey installing those stainless steel rods. And in this case, the elevation is definitely keeping up with sea level rise. When we look at the slope of this, it's doing just fine, and it's actually exceeding sea level rise rates. And that's not unusual in restoration sites. So first thing to know is they added a bunch of sand. And then they added a bunch of plants and we maintain the site, right? And it's behind a revetment. So this is not unusual and needs to be evaluated in the context of where it is. We also have sites in Parker's Creek that we think give us a more natural view of sea level rise, and they're also doing fine. The western shore of the Chesapeake Bay tends to do in the wetlands to be keeping up with sea level rise rates. We can look at marker horizon data, which tell us kind of how much sediment has grown. So this is, or accreted. And this is also good news. There's been great accretion. So that underground biomass of the plants is bulking up the sediments and creating more elevation for the marsh. So these are also great data. The sad data that I'll kind of end on has to do with the shoreline of this cuspate foreland. And these are measurements that are taken of shoreline elevation. And what I want you to note is transect line 8 that you'll see in the next slide, and where it is in location to the Segwated breakwaters and the revetments. So here's line 8, okay? And what you're looking at right now is rates of shoreline change in elevation. And for those of you who live there, this is probably not big news, that some of the shoreline is definitely experiencing a loss in elevation along that beach. And, you know, we're trying to suggest options to BHG for what to do about this. There is a breach here. There's going to be a planting event in the spring. They've put in temporary measures around core logs, but it likely needs a more permanent solution. And they are committing to an engineering study to help figure that out too. So this is part of why we do monitoring and why my academic integrity here at the lab, part of what I'm doing is saying, hey guys, like this is something we got to pay attention to, right? And these are some of those overwash locations for those of you who walk the beach might have seen. We've had overwashes just past that segmented breakwater all the way through to 2021, and then Ophelia brought another overwash. And so Cindy and Julia and Caitlin do special monitoring around these overwash areas. They happen to have some endangered species in them, so things are a little complicated, and I'm telling you that so that hopefully you won't go and steal them or run over them with your dog, but it does make what we do to correct those breaches a little more complicated. And I'll just end with some images. So this is just post restoration in 2011. This is what it looks like now. Clearly you can see the change in the shoreline below the revetment. And also you can see a little bit of change in the marsh, and the vegetation response has been really, really great. So final thoughts. Cuspate forelands are dynamic. So we've done some engineering here. It's also important to remember this land is meant to move. It is meant to move. The Cove Point Marsh is a really special ecosystem, and having spent a lot of time there, that's true not only about the plants, which of course I love, but there's bald eagles, there's beavers. I think Melissa Day swore there was an alligator in there once. You know, it's a really wonderful, special place. And so part of the impetus for trying to preserve it is well placed because we don't have a lot of wetlands like this left that have so many special plant species in particular. It has a healthy wild rice population. It has a healthy carex population. It has a skullcap scutellaria that's found in only a couple other places in the whole state. And it has that beautiful ammonia, that water plant, just all over the place. You can tell my love for plants. I mean, it's just amazing what Cove Point can do in terms of diversity. Hopefully you've learned wetlands connect the land with the water, and in tidal settings, sea level rise and its impacts can affect these ecosystems. All of these factors intersect with changes in wetland plant communities. That frag, it's invasive, it also holds sediment. So how do we deal with that? That's a constant struggle that we're talking about. And finally, as a society, I think what I hope you're getting from my talk is that we're all experimenting, both scientists, managers, engineers, communities, within a really urgent context, because we need solutions yesterday around whether to mitigate, whether to adapt, whether to migrate as humans. And we're gonna be making mistakes, we're gonna be learning from our mistakes. And yet, like, if we don't have opportunities to do that, the alternatives are not that great. And I'm a pragmatist. I am absolutely like, you know, yes, we need to document the past. Yes, we need to document the whys. We also need solutions. So that's one of the reasons why this project personally feels very satisfying for me to work. And it is right at 7. I want to throw up some photos of some awesome people, put their names up here again, because they do all the hard work. This is not an easy environment to work in. You know, mud, wasps, snakes, heat, everything. It's working at that mayonnaise interface of land and sea is incredibly hard, and they do so much work. So thank you for listening tonight, and thanks for coming to CBL.